Can you press the record button? Thank you. So hello everyone, welcome to our fourth and last event of our Open Access Week 2021 that is organized at Masaryk University. We are going to talk about preprints and human social studies, etc. with connection to SOS archive. We invited international speaker, Professor Cohen from University of Maryland, where he works at Department of Sociology, and he's a professor there and director of graduate studies. He is also, but very special to open access, he is the founding director of SOS archive. So this is very important archive in the social sciences. So with that, dear professor, we are very happy that you are here with us. We are looking for your lecture, and after the lecture, I will be also the moderator of the discussion. So everyone enjoy this presentation, and Professor Cohen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for paying attention to this issue and celebrating Open Access Week. Also for allowing me to speak English. And I will be happy to take your questions or discussion at the end, or if I don't know if it's convenient for you to interrupt. It's okay if anybody needs to interrupt me to ask a question or something as we go. So I'll go through my slides. But I won't be able to see your faces, so I'll just be talking here, and then I'll be happy to hear from you at the end. There's some information about me. I am a sociologist at the University of Maryland, and the paper archive that I am the director of is called SOC Archive. Which is an archive of social sciences, also arts and humanities, education, and law. There's my contact information on the slide, and I will share the slides. Actually, I can give you this address in the chat if the chat works.
Yeah, it should be okay.
So if you're interested in the in having the slides, they are available there. And now, where's my, okay, good. Okay, so let's begin. Preprints, what are preprints? What are we talking about? There's actually not one definition, but two popular views. And one, a preprint is a finished draft. It's a completed work, not finished, but finished enough to read. A finished draft, that is, and not yet peer-reviewed. So it's not yet published in a journal or a book, but it is ready to be read. So it has a beginning and an end, so to speak. The other definition is that after something is published in a journal or a book or somewhere else, the preprint may be the free version that you share after it has been peer-reviewed and published. And we would still call that a preprint, even though the thing has already been published. In a way, it may be better called a postprint. But either way, it's a formal scholarly output. It's a piece of research. It's a permanent, citable part of the scholarly record. But it fills a niche between creation and peer review. And very crucially, it's openly accessible. I have here the logos of a few of the bigger, more prominent preprint servers. The original service is called Archive. That X is actually supposed to be a Greek chi. That's why we pronounce it Archive. Archive, the original one was in mathematics, also focused on physics, and now has expanded to include other areas, especially computer science and all kinds of things like that. The rapidly growing services now are in bioarchive and medRxiv, which are life science, biology, and health sciences. And I'll talk some more about those today. They're of particular interest. And then our service, Social Archive, there's another Sci Archive, which is for psychology. And there are many others, but these are some of the prominent ones that you can look for. And we can talk about others if you like during the discussion. So why are people doing this? Why are people publishing preprints instead of just waiting for the process to complete and publishing peer-reviewed work? Well, this speaks to the overall motivation for open science or open scholarship, which is to be more efficient, that is to move faster and more cheaply, lower cost and higher speed, which allows us to be more engaging, that is to reach people and exchange ideas with them more effectively, and also more inclusive, because preprints reduce cost barriers and access issues that come in many traditional journals. So we find when we're talking about Social Archive that it's effective to discuss these issues. Time. There is a terrible period for a researcher in between the time when you have accomplished a piece of work and you're happy and proud and you want people to read it. And then this long period of weeks or months, sometimes years goes by before the people that you really want to read it can read it. And in fact, your paper may be sitting at a journal waiting for people who don't really want to read it, who are the reviewers. They're not dying to read it. They have agreed to do this service of reviewing papers, but there are people out there who want to read your work and you have to wait so long. We also want people to be able to access our work. And we understand that there's an economics to publishing, but we don't want it to be locked up and inaccessible, especially those of us who are in positions of trust and support from our governments or other public agencies which are supporting our work. And then we wanted to reach as many people as possible. And in order to make our work better and make our careers and lives more rich and interesting, we want to be able to connect with other scholars. We want to have a deeper engagement. And we want to do that, we're going to need to reclaim the process of publishing. So we can't, in order to have the most fulfilling work and have our work be as effective as possible, we can't leave the publishing process entirely to the publishers who have captured so much of that. So here's a look at the traditional, what we call the traditional publishing process. This is focused on journals, and this slide is from our friends at ASAP Bio, who are involved with bioRxiv and are very active promoters of the use of preprints. In this traditional model, you have written your manuscript, you send it to a journal. You wait a few weeks, a few months, maybe you get 3 negative reviews and it gets rejected. Okay, life goes on. You revise the paper, you send it to another journal. In this case, well, maybe you've made improvements, maybe a different journal. Okay, now maybe 2 positive reviews, 1 negative review. You're going to revise it again. You know, either send it to the same journal, journal 2, or if it was rejected, to another journal. Now, eventually, months or years have gone by, and you are able to publish it. It goes out. Okay, at that point is when your work enters the community stage of feedback and ideas and discussion, and you're able to have a record of the work that was done, who did what work and when. You're able to appeal to people to read the work. You have the stamp of legitimacy that says some people have recognized that this work is good. And you even have sort of the branding or the approval of a journal to say this journal sort of has nominated this work as worthy of being read. But all of this takes place so much later after the original manuscript is written. Of course, and I'll just talk about this, peer review is very important. This is how we validate our work and we confirm that our work is suitable for entry into the permanent pantheon of knowledge, so to speak. But it doesn't have to be that no one can read it until that point. In the preprint model, it enters into that public arena at the beginning of the process. That is, you've written the draft, and then while it's going through peer review, it can also be being read by people who are interested in reading it. So that after a simple screening process, you put it on a preprint server, and then you have certain of those functions are already available to you. You have the public record that says we did this work at this time. You have the communicative function where you can say to people, please have a look at our work. We would appreciate your response and your feedback. We'd like you to know about this work. And that can be going on while the peer review process is happening, essentially moving on two tracks at once. Then you get to the part where it's published and you can say it's been approved and a journal has validated this work as important and so on. But in the meantime, you have helped other people and other people have helped you, and everybody's work has progressed during that crucial time in the research, because as we know from the research on how scholarship works, the most important period for a new piece of research is right after it's published. That is when it gets the most attention and usually the most attention and the most citations. Some work builds later, but that key period in the first year or two is very important. Okay, so here's just a short visual description of sort of how research in science works. We have a cycle. It goes around and around, where we search and discover the knowledge that already exists. We develop new research ideas. Based on those ideas, we design a piece of research that we're going to do. It involves usually collecting some data, which we then analyze, interpret, and publish. It enters into the body of knowledge and the process repeats. This is an ongoing process. Now, we tend to focus on peer review as the moment between analysis and publishing. That is, you've done everything and now you're ready to publish it, and that's when peer review happens. But the truth is, in the research community today, evaluation happens at many stages, and we don't have to think about the peer review process, the journal peer review process, as the only thing that makes it okay to share our work. In fact, our work is evaluated by people at different stages. If we are funded by a granting agency, if we are presenting aspects of the work earlier in conferences, if we're developing the pieces of work to share with other groups, like giving talks like this, we are vetted and evaluated across a variety of institutions. And in fact, even ourselves, beyond a particular piece of work being evaluated, if you have a position, you have a faculty position, a graduate student, a postdoc, you already have some status to speak. So we don't have to have approval, a peer review approval for everything that we say. Peer review plays a very important function for establishing validity of particular pieces of research, but we don't have to wait for peer review for every communication we have in the research community. So how open science works is it addresses the entire research life cycle and finds opportunities to accelerate and open that work. So, for example, down at the bottom of the figure, in between study design and collecting data, researchers who use experimental methods especially have begun pre-registering their work. In that case, the research design may be peer-reviewed so that somebody has agreed to publish the results regardless of what you find. And that's a way of establishing the correct sequencing of the research, where you're not designing your hypotheses after you've already seen the results. We also are doing much better at sharing the materials and the methods and the data that we have collected. And part of this revolution in science, this open science movement, is publishing our work as preprints, that is, before it goes through journal peer review. So I just want to put it in the context of the whole research life cycle, which has opportunities within it to open and accelerate our work. So here's a look at where we are with preprints over the last 3 decades or so. I mentioned Archive is the original preprint server that established the concept. It was started at, developed at Cornell University and was run by the university library. And this is the annual number of papers. So you can see that by now Archive is publishing more than 150,000 papers per year. Still by far the largest preprint server. But in the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen a rapid rise in other preprint servers. BioArchive is the most important individual service, which has arisen in the last few years, and its partner in the health sciences, medRxiv. Those are operated by the publisher Cold Spring Harbor. The category other EPMC is the other preprint servers, which are indexed by the European PubMed Central operation, the Open Science Framework preprint server, and then I listed SciArchive and SocArchive. There are some others as well, but as you can see, they're getting smaller and smaller. But overall, we're up to approaching 400,000 preprints to be published this year. These are almost all in English, so I'm mostly referring to that literature, although, as I'll mention, SocArchive accepts papers in any language that we can translate with Google Translate, or if one of our volunteers can translate or can read it for us. So we have people reading in German and Swedish and Spanish, and then we use translating software to take other papers. I'll talk about that in a minute. So if we're up to about 350,000 papers per year as preprints, if you compare that to the whole corpus of, say, the Web of Science database, preprints are equal to about 14% of that total and increasing fairly rapidly. So it's a very substantial, but not dominant part of the research landscape at this point. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, which has transformed our lives and our careers in so many ways, mostly, of course, for the worst, being a giant crisis and tragedy for so many people. It has also been a time when a new model of disseminating research has really taken hold. And the preprints have been a really important and indeed life-saving aspect of our global scientific response to the pandemic. This is from an analysis by Fraser et al. Published in PLOS Biology this year that looked at the first 10 months of the pandemic. During that time, they found 125,000 roughly articles published on COVID-19 topics, and about 30,000 of those were published as preprints. So a large portion of the research that was coming out as preprints first. And crucially, what they did in this analysis was they examined a selection of those papers and saw what happened to them after they were published as preprints. And many of them were published in journals, and often with very few substantive changes. And what that implies was that the research was really ready for a lot of those papers already. So in that sense, we can think of it as a social good that they were published earlier because we got the information out if it was important. Some of those preprints were shared thousands of times and had a big impact. I will give some examples in a moment before they were peer reviewed. Now, some of them were wrong, and there were some were influential and wrong, and that, of course, is problematic. But that's also how science works. When science enters into the public discourse and gets more attention, especially if it's on an important topic, we can find out if it's wrong actually sooner. You can see the different services here. The largest related to the pandemic was medRxiv. That's SSRN is the next one, the Social Science Research Network, which is operated by Elsevier, and the other services there. So up to over 30,000 altogether by the end of last fall. So obviously more now. So one of the things that happened was, as preprints were coming out, over the course of the pandemic, we couldn't wait. The public needed information as quickly as possible. And the news media ended up playing a really important role working with preprints. And of course, that makes people nervous because we often cherish the peer review process, but we had to get the work out because lives were at stake. This is from the medRxiv preprint service, and you can see they put a caution on their papers. Preprints are preliminary works that have not been certified by peer review. They should not be relied upon for clinical practice and shouldn't be reported as established information. Okay, they need to say that because they really didn't want doctors to start making decisions and public health authorities to start making decisions based on unverified information. However, as we've already seen, many preprints were really good and important and needed to get out. So what ended up happening was there were journalists, good journalists, who used other indicators of reliability besides traditional peer review. They looked at who the researchers were, what was their record, where did they work. They would take the preprint to other experts and conduct sort of their own informal peer review, sometimes very good. If a reporter from a major newspaper, from the BBC or the New York Times, calls me and says, there's a new preprint, I'd like your evaluation of it, I will give them that evaluation right away because I understand that it's important, it could have a big impact, and I want my name in the newspaper. So they would conduct essentially informal peer review. Many journalists have their own, they know a lot about science also. And then they would go by newsworthiness. I'm sorry, that's spelled wrong. They would go by whether it was important. So preprints entered the news and in very important ways. Here's an example. We learned very early, this is from the Washington Post, that deaths related to the pandemic were much higher than were officially counted. That was very important early information to understand the weaknesses of our testing regime in the United States, that there were people who were sick and dying that were not being counted, but we could see them in the total death toll, even if their deaths were not attributed to the pandemic. That was a preprint that made it into the news and was very influential. Here is another one, an early analysis of the effect of shutting down certain activities to protect people from the transmission of the virus. An analysis that showed by comparing different areas of the country that had the shutdowns occurred earlier, we would have saved lives. Okay, this was subsequently published. It turned out to be quite reliable, but it came out in the news very quickly because it was a preprint and the news organization did their own vetting and evaluation. Again, I'm absolutely not diminishing the importance of peer review, but in this crisis moments, I just want to show that there are other ways to get out important information because other people who have expertise and authority and legitimacy can evaluate information outside of the journal peer review process. That's the point I'm trying to make. One more from an example closer to my own research, less life or death, but nevertheless still important, what was happening within families. We saw that so many families were staying home if they were in professional jobs or online jobs that could be done from home. Other people, families were being divided by people having to go out of the house and do their work and come back, possibly putting their families at risk. So there was a lot of change, stress, and tension within families. And one thing that we found relatively early was men were actually doing more housework in families where people were staying home. An interesting early finding, subsequently also will be published, or if it's not already been published, and we were able to get it out sooner. In this case, published by the Council on Contemporary Families, not journal peer review, but another group of experts who evaluate work. Okay. So let's look at what preprints look like, how they actually work. Here's an example from bioRxiv. And again, this is from our friends at ASAP Bio, credit on this slide. So here's a paper called Stable Integrin Specific Differences in Bimodal HIV-1 Expression Patterns Revealed by High Throughput Analysis, something I know absolutely nothing about, but I can tell you what's happening in this preprint. It's posted very quickly, so it gets out. It is like a paper. It contains all the information necessary to replicate or review the work. just like it would in a journal. That's something that bioRxiv prizes very highly. It is a permanent piece of scholarship. So it is a part of the scholarly record. One way that we indicate that is with DOI, a digital object identifier, and a permanent URL. So except in exceptional circumstances, preprints are not removed. That is, they enter the public record. So publishing a preprint is quite a serious decision because you can't unpublish it usually, unless it turns out to be some legal problem or something like that. It is citable. So people can cite preprints in their papers, in their grants, grant applications. The work that's happening right now often is where people want to cite preprints because they need to cite the very latest work. It's versionable. I said it couldn't be unpublished, but a key feature of preprints is when you revise it, you can update it. So, and I'll give the example on SocArchive. You post your new version, and the new version is what readers see first at that permanent address. So they come to this web page, they see the latest version. The history is also preserved, however, so the scholarly record is preserved. If somebody cited it in the meantime, in the first version, that record is preserved, but you can also improve it as your research progresses. There's a variety of licenses that are applied to preprints that allow for their dissemination or reuse or modification, depending on the license that the author chooses. This preprint has a CC BY license that says you're free to reuse this work as long as you attribute it properly and link back to the original source. All preprint servers have some kind of mechanism to allow feedback, whether it's from comments directly on the site or from social media or journal clubs or however people discuss work in progress and new work in their fields. It is posted on bioRxiv. It is only before peer review is when you post the work. I'll mention on SocArchive we're a little bit different. This is complete work, but before journal peer review. The site calculates various metrics of the kind that we're used to at this point. So there's download data, how often it's been cited, mentioned in the media, and so on. And that information is captured and right on the page. This is what it looks like at SocArchive. You'll see it's pretty similar. SocArchive, again, Soc stands for social, so it's social science, arts, humanities, education, and law. We're a paper server. We are not limited to preprints. So I'm talking about preprints. That's a formal definition a lot of people use, but as I'll explain, versions evolve, and on SocArchive, we take papers at various stages. So here's what you see on the page. This is one of my papers. You see how many times it's been downloaded. You see we have integration with Hypothesis, which allows annotation and commenting on the paper, which can be done publicly or privately if you have a Hypothesis account. We have the Plaudit plugin, which allows people to do their own individual review. You can, if you have a ORCID ID, you can endorse a work on our system, and it becomes, and you're giving it your approval. We archive and make accessible the supplemental materials related to each paper if authors want to provide that. The paper has a DOI when it is posted on SocArchive. So that is the location, the digital object identifier, and the permanent address for this paper. In this case, the paper was subsequently published in this journal called Socius. And here you can see I have posted the published version, the journal published version. It's still at this address where the pre-published version was, where the preprint was. Now the published version is there. It's an open access journal, so I can share this version. And the journal publication DOI is right here on the same page. So if you read my paper in an earlier version on SocArchive and you come back to this page to cite it, you'll now see, oh, it's been published in a journal. I can cite the journal version as the latest version or the version of record if that's what I choose to do. I have given this paper a CC0 license, so anybody can do anything they want with it. On Social Archive, we have a taxonomy of subject that people choose, as well as free text tags that they can enter. And here, crucially, is the version information. When you come to the page, you're looking at the most recent version automatically, but the previous versions are there. So if somebody has cited the paper a year or two ago, because this paper has been up for a while, they can go back and look at that previous version, but most people aren't going to want to do that. They're just going to want to see the latest version. So this means if somebody has cited the paper a year or two ago, or linked to the paper in a news article or a blog or on social media, if somebody clicks on that link now 2 years later, they're coming to the final journal version. So it really is helping to both accelerate the publication process as well as preserve the scholarly record and make it more accessible and efficient. That's how we'd like to see it. Again, on Social Archive, we cover those subjects I mentioned. This is in English. Most of our work is in English. However, when people submit papers that are not in English, we have a group of volunteer moderators. We review the papers very lightly. That is, we don't read the papers all the way through and verify whether they're true or good. We simply verify that they are research papers, that they're written by who they say they're written by, that they're categorized correctly, that they're legible, that they're in a proper format for reading. And we can do that review even using automated translation in many cases. So when we get papers in languages that we don't speak individually as the moderators, we can often review and accept them. It may take a little bit longer. It may take a day or two to get reviewed. A key observation that I just want to make while I'm on the page about Social Archive is posting a paper on Social Archive is wonderful. It is a sign of your productivity. It means you've done something, you've done some work. However, it is not an indicator of the quality of the work. So it's not an accomplishment that it was accepted by Social Archive. You have done the work and you can use it to show your productivity, but the publication of it itself is not the accomplishment to be rewarded. It's the content that may or may not be good. So we hope it is, but I also am happy to admit that there are bad papers on Social Archive. It's not like a journal where if there's a bad paper, it makes all the other papers look bad. We don't want there to be terrible work that's not real research, but we're not there to verify the quality. It's a different model of dissemination. Of course, a lot of our work is wonderful and excellent and very impactful, such as my own. Just kidding. Okay. So if you're going to share preprints, when in the research process would you do it? I presented that life cycle diagram and I sort of made it simple, but there are specific moments when I think you should consider it. If you want feedback, if you want to engage with collaborators, including collaborators that you don't know, and this is a key part of the process. There may be people working in your area of research who you don't know, or you only know a little bit, and you are in a competitive relationship with them, right? You're racing to get your work done, to get your work out, and you may feel that your interests are not aligned. However, if you share work early, you can give them feedback, they can give you feedback, you can become collaborators and friends more easily than you can if you only interact after the work is published. Once the work is published, people tend to get a little bit defensive. They don't want to hear criticism and suggestions as much. But while the work is in process, that person who gives you a suggestion could be saving you from embarrassment or improving your work, and you could become excellent friends for the rest of your lives. So this is a good opportunity to find collaborators. Other times when you might want to post a preprint is when you are submitting it to a conference. That means you're ready to have people read it, at least some people. So maybe consider the public. When you're submitting into a journal, you at this point have some confidence in the paper. You know it's at least good enough to have some experts in your field read it, so maybe consider sharing it more widely at that point. If you're a little bit less sure, you can wait until the paper is accepted. Often months go by after a paper is accepted and before it's published, you may as well at that point be distributing the preprints so that people can start reading it. If you see on social media, you often see people say, oh, I've had a paper accepted. It's going to be published in 6 months. Isn't that terrific? And everybody says, oh, that's great. Congratulations. Where is the paper? At that moment, you have a lively audience of people who are excited about your work. And then to tell them you can read it in 6 months, or please email me and I'll send a copy. It's very inefficient and exclusive. You can be open and accessible and just say it's accepted. The peer reviewers have said it's good, so we know it's validated, it's verified. Here's a copy. And then finally, if none of that is good enough, you can always, after it is published, especially if it's published in a paywall journal that not everybody has access to, you may very well, depending on the author agreement that you sign with the journal, you may very well have the right to publish a preprint after the journal article is published. And that would be allowing the work to be distributed for free without undermining the peer review process. And that will be that's a question of what are the policies of the journal that you publish it in, and the agreement that you sign with them, the licensing agreement. So that becomes important. And I should just mention, your librarians can help you with that process to understand what rights are you giving away, what rights are you keeping, where are you publishing. Those are complicated issues for researchers. That's not our expertise. I'm a sociologist. I'm not an expert in publishing, but you can learn how to do it by consulting the appropriate people who do understand how it works, and then you learn. Here are some common concerns that people have with posting preprints. We feel we are experts in our work, and yet often we're insecure about the quality of our work. Maybe it's not good enough. Maybe I don't want to share it because I value the peer review process. I don't want to impose my work on an audience before it is verified as good or important. And so we have this tendency towards self-doubt. We would encourage you to be proud of your work and share your work, even knowing that you may be making mistakes. Mistakes are part of the research process, and it's okay. Now, some work is just not ready. You don't want to embarrass yourself, but think about whether or not it's at the stage when an interested audience could read it without and do more good than harm by reading it. And this does not mean disrespecting or undermining the peer review process. You're accelerating the process. A lot of people are afraid that if they post preprints, they will not be able to publish the work subsequently in a journal. I actually don't know about your situation, your local situation. I do know that in the English language journals, especially in social sciences, most journals will consider articles that have already been published as preprints. It's become very standard. In fact, in biology, for example, there's a prominent journal, eLife, which only reviews papers which have been published as preprints. That is, they review them in the preprint stage for the journal. Many other journals take submissions to their journal through a preprint server. So it's become a very accepted part of the process to publish preprints. I'm posting there the website for Sherpa Romeo, which is a very good database of journal policies. And there you can look up a specific journal and see what their license allows. And you don't want to undermine your ability to publish subsequently. So it's good to check the policies. I would also say, though, if you have a choice of what journal to publish in, and we usually do, if a journal that you're thinking about does not allow the dissemination of preprints, I think it's worth asking whether or not they are really working in the public interest. And maybe we want to devote our efforts to journals that are more compatible with our values. That's my personal opinion. Many people are concerned that if they post a preprint, somebody will take their idea. They will be scooped in the language of the parlance. We think this is actually backwards. That is, by posting your work publicly with a timestamp in a permanent location, you're actually protecting yourself against that. That is, you're actually planting your flag on the idea and the piece of work and your methods and your results earlier than you would if you waited for a journal publication. So this is actually getting your work into the public record, allowing people to cite it, and preventing the work from being appropriated by others in that informal stage when it's just under development. So this concern is reasonable that people are worried, but it's actually backwards, and you protect yourself more by publishing preprints, we think. Okay, approaching the end, I'll just mention different preprint servers allow a complicated array of licenses. When you post the work, the question is, what can be done with it? Excuse me. I wanted to mention that our community norms, our norms in academia, are what govern the issue of citation. If somebody is going to cite your work, that's not a legal obligation. That's a question of ethics and norms. So that's separate from the licensing. If I take somebody's idea, I'm influenced by it, I take some information from them, it's my ethical and normative obligation to cite their work, regardless of whether it's copyrighted or not copyrighted. That's a professional obligation. Nevertheless, when we publish work, it has some status as far as what people can do with it, with that information in that document. So the Creative Commons licenses are commonly used for preprints, and here they're presented on a continuum from open to closed. Essentially, CC0 is like this presentation I'm giving you today is under CC0 license. It's in the public domain. I have waived my right to it. You can take this talk that I'm giving and you can sell it to somebody for $1 million, and I have no claim to stop you from doing that. If you do, please let me know, because I'll be impressed. It allows anybody to use the work, to reuse it in any medium. This is the easy, if you put your work in this format, remember, people still have an ethical obligation to cite you. It just means the document itself can go anywhere and be used. It can be cut up and remashed and so on. Okay, this is ideal for data sets where people are definitely going to manipulate the work before reusing it, because they're going to reanalyze the data and so on. In the US, all US government work is automatically copyright free. A more common use for preprints is what we call CC BY. That is, you're free to repost the work, you can modify the work, you can distribute it however you like, but you must attribute it to its original author and link back to where you got it. So for example, the slides that I borrowed from ASAP Bio earlier in this talk, I mentioned where they came from. You can find those on, I didn't put the text of the link in the talk, but I attributed them, and with the date, you can find them where they are. This is encouraged by the National Institutes of Health in the US, and it fits the original conception of open access because it allows reuse, which is a key part of openness. The other CC licenses have various restrictions on their use. We would not call them open access. They're open in the sense that anybody can read them, but either they have a limitation on commercial use, or you can't modify the work, or you must share it with the same license that you got it, and so on. So, and then finally, if you put no license, you're essentially, at least under US law, and I apologize that that's my focus, you're putting no license. That means you're maintaining your copyright. You're not licensing it for public use. So people can read it, but you're not giving them permission to do anything else with it. So those are the license options. Okay, to summarize, and here again, I'm using a slide I modified from ASAP Bio. The key aspect of preprints is accelerating discovery. So people are going to find the work faster, okay? And I would say for better or worse, okay? But we're accelerating the process. You're getting more feedback that allows you to improve it. You may be finding colleagues, editors, publishers that are interested in the work that may want to engage with you earlier in the process. You're gaining visibility for yourself and your career and your work and your ideas. So for early career scholars, this may be an important way of establishing some reputation in that key several years of developing your public reputation. You're creating a record that allows you to establish precedents in the scholarly literature that identifies who did what and when. You're demonstrating your productivity. Like I said, it's not an assessment of quality, but it says, look, I've written a paper, I'm doing work, I'm getting it out there. And you can also know that you're making scholarship in science better by being more open and accessible and inclusive. So if that's an important value to you, you can achieve that and also signal that value to others by presenting your work as preprints. So with that, I'm going to stop my lecture and I'll be happy to take your questions and comments now. Thank you again for having me.
So thank you very much for a very nice presentation. And I have several questions, but firstly, I will ask dear participants, does anyone has a question? Please write it in the chat or jump directly to the discussion. Everything is allowed. Thank you very much.
I can start maybe. Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking, can you think of a case when you would prefer to select a Creative Commons license that is more restrictive, for example, the non-commercial, no derivatives, so on, instead of CC BY?
I think it's unusual that would be important to do. There are some publishers may prefer that you do that, so that their ability to sell your work is not undermined. So I think it would, in my case, I think it would only be if someone else that wanted to use the work felt that was important. One thing that is, if I publish a paper with CC BY and somebody might use a figure from that paper in, for example, a textbook or an advertisement or something. Because I do demography, it's sort of like, oh, look, here's the divorce rate. Maybe somebody wants to use that figure. If that makes me uncomfortable, I could attach a non-commercial license. I mostly feel like if they can sell it, that's basically good. It's not hurting me. My career is not protected by, is not enhanced by my ability to sell that work. One caution I would say is that it's increasingly important that people do research by, with machine reading many papers, meta-science, research on research. And when you put restrictive licenses, their code, their software, which is analyzing a big corpus of literature, may not include your work because it throws off, they can't evaluate whether they can use it, so they end up just excluding it. So the open license allows the work to be included in meta-science better. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I was asking because our research group has been publishing preprints for all our work, I think. And recently we came across this situation that we got a paper accepted to a journal, and they offered us the option to have it either under CC BY or CC NC and so on, the more restrictive ones. And we weren't sure which one to choose, and my supervisor opted to be more cautious, so we selected a bit more restrictive one. But yeah, that's what I was asking. So thank you.
That's very that it's very common that I don't know the ages of the people involved, but the older people are often more cautious about these things. That's reasonable. One thing that in a case like that, you may still be able to share a preprint version in a less restrictive way if you want to. But it sounds like the journal is an open access journal, and so that seems fine.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Sure.
So thank you very much, and I will add also the same recommendation from like open science support from Masaryk University. There is usually no need to use restrictive licenses. There are, for example, very special cases. Maybe if you are publishing a book, so this is a little bit different than if you are publishing the article. But for example, we got quite concerns, for example, about they will disinterpret, etc. But if you think about it in global, so they can do it whether it's CC BY or CC and so this is it. So thank you very much for a question and answer. Next question I can see in chat. I don't know from who is it. It's just a number, so I will read it. Thank you for a great talk. How is the preprint? How is preprint cited after having the published version? Does it change?
That's a good question. If you look at the Social Archive preprint, our service produces a suggested citation for each paper. And generally you essentially treat the preprint server like the journal where it's published. So you have the date and the author name and the link to it. It's pretty common that you cite a preprint in your initial version of the paper, and then months go by. Eventually, when your article is being published, the preprint that you cited may now be published in a journal also, and you can update that citation. However, all the major preprint servers will include that forward citation information. So if you cite my preprint and your paper is published, and then my paper is published after that, and then readers come to the preprint page, they will see that journal information. So they will be able to cite your work in the journal form. But it's perfectly acceptable to update the reference if the status of it changes during the publication process. And sometimes the content can change, right? Sometimes you might say, Philip Cohen found the divorce rate is 43%. And then a year goes by, I realize I made a mistake. The divorce rate is actually 44%, and you might want to update that anyway. So we shouldn't assume that the work doesn't change between statuses. But if you're saying, Philip Cohen does interesting work about divorce, and you want to cite it, that's fine. That's not gonna change. But the nice thing about it is, with the permanent identifiers that we use, we're bringing some order to the world of metadata, as we like to say. So hopefully the different versions are linked, and the main thing is that the record is preserved. Good question.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? So maybe I will have one follow-up. What about OrgID? You have the journals there, you have the published articles there, and you can have also preprints. That's right. It's a common practice.
Yes. So I'm sorry, is it common practice to link your ORCID ID?
Yeah, ORCID ID with the preprints as well.
Yes. So when you post an article, a paper on Social Archive, same with bioRxiv, you have an opportunity to link your ORCID ID to your profile. So that will, it does not display on Social Archive, it doesn't display on the paper. On bioRxiv, if you notice from my example, the ORCID are right there next to the people's name. That's very nice. We don't require ORCID IDs, although we're actually moving toward a policy where I think we might. Using permanent identifiers. So DOIs identify work, ORCIDs identify people. And in either case, it's very good for the scholarly record to have permanent identifiers that travel with people as they change jobs, they might change their name, they publish different kinds of work. So we really recommend using ORCIDs, but we don't require it, but they are they're in your profile on the platform that we use. They're just not shown on the paper. However, when you submit a paper, you can put your ORCID on the title page, and I would recommend that you do that. And that way, people can link to your whole scholarly record, to your website, to your whatever else you have on your ORCID record. So I highly recommend that, although we don't at the moment require it. If that's an answer your question.
Thank you very much. I will follow up with one more question, and please, participants, think about other questions during that. Basically, can you comment a little bit more about the history of preprints, actually, because it was a boom, it was a boom. Then with the changes of APC for journal articles, more and more fully open access journals, it was, at least from the Czech perspective, I would say, or at least what I had the experience, it went a little bit down, the interest in preprints, etc. But for example, now we have a new policy of the European Horizon Europe program scheme, when they basically have two types of practices. Mandatory, that's you have to make it open access and you have to put the data also open. But on the other hand, they are recommended. There are some recommended practices, and they are talking, for example, about yearly sharing of your research. And the researchers should also evaluate if these practices should be interesting for the project, and they should maybe mention it also in the project proposal stage. So this is, from me, at least from the European perspective, kind of putting very good usefulness for preprint and pre-registration, etc., of these practices into everyday practice of researchers. So do you see it also in the USA, or how it is developing? Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question. It's a little bit complicated, but in answer to how they're used earlier in the research process, it has been debated a fair amount, but now our research agencies encourage citation of preprints in grant proposals, and also in grant results when you're reporting on the work that you've done, to report the preprints. And it has reached the point where in the research community, we understand that a preprint may not be peer reviewed, but it's still a contribution that can be evaluated. So people who are applying for jobs, people who are applying for grants, people who are reporting on the progress that they have made, they cite their preprints, and it allows evaluation of the work earlier. For example, if we're hiring somebody for a faculty position, if they share their preprints, we're experts, and we're interested in hiring the person, it's worth it for us to spend an hour reading the paper, and knowing that it is in public on a preprint server signals that the person is taking accountability and transparently opening themselves up to evaluation. So it sends a very positive signal for things like hiring and grants. Now, as the publication landscape has changed, on the one hand, you do have more policies encouraging early dissemination and often requiring open dissemination, because people who fund research have realized that they get more impact if their research that they fund is freely available. So big funders like Gates and Wellcome and the private foundations, many of them have realized, and they just require it. And then also the government agencies in Europe, more so even than the US, they're interested in having the work. But it is true that in journal publishing, with open access publishing, there are more opportunities to publish freely and even more rapidly than there used to be. So you could say that in some sense, the need for preprints has been reduced because you can publish your work quickly in an open access journal. There are potential problems with that. The cost is one. What are you paying to disseminate that work as far as the APC, the article processing charge? Who is paying that? And the ethical issues that may arise from people who are from companies or journals that are saying, if you pay us, we'll publish your work. So there, that can be understandable. They're providing a service, you're disseminating the work, but the issues of quality and quality control for that money have raised ethical problems. Okay, I don't want to cast aspersions on open access journals or on journals that use APCs, but it raises the issue. You still, in my opinion, can best signal your transparency and openness by posting preprints which you're not paying to publish, and which are freely available to everybody. So that's the best signal of openness in your work, and I would still recommend that you do that. And open access journals will not mind if you do that. So you will not foreclose the publication in an open access journal by publishing a preprint in advance. So there is, for all the debate about publishing models and who will pay APCs, will universities pay, will the funders pay, will the libraries pay? There's a counter proposal which they call Plan U, which was to counter Plan S in Europe. Plan U is universal. Plan U says post a preprint. It solves the problem. Then if somebody else wants to publish it and sell it, that's fine. They're not taking away anybody else's access to it. So from a point of view of a funding agency or a foundation, if they implement their own Plan U, they can just say, the work we're funding must be open, post a preprint, and then you can publish it, you can win awards, you can have peer review, you can have that process go on also, but in the meantime, let people read the work.
Thank you very much. Just one add up. We have now a kind of experiment in Europe. It's called Open Research Europe. That's basically an open peer review publishing platform that is like free for the grant holders of Horizon Europe, and we will see what it's going to make with all the publishing space in the Czech, not Czech Republic, but in Europe in general. We have another question for the participants. What's the difference of sharing a paper in soc.archive, bioarchive, or medRxiv if it is not reviewed? Does it make it accessible to specific people in the field? That's from chat. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. In one sense, it doesn't matter very much. That is, none of those sites are heavily screening on quality. So mostly what you're doing by putting it on the preprint server is preserving it, archiving it, and making it available to the public. So, and you can accomplish that on many different platforms. In the case of bioarchive and medRxiv, one thing to know is that they have agreements with publishers that will allow you to submit it to a journal directly from the platform. So that's a good service that many authors enjoy. Bioarchive and medRxiv have some stricter controls than we do on the issue of the style and format. For example, bioarchive does not accept theoretical theory or commentary. So only empirical research in the particular standard format of biology paper. Whereas soc.archive, if you write a book review, if you write a review essay, if you write a theoretical piece, if you write in using one paper format or another paper format, that's all okay with us. If it's within the bounds of research in your discipline, then we're going to accept it. So we have papers in geography and archaeology and anthropology and sociology and social work and economics, and they all have different norms and standards. So we're not putting, we're not enforcing that kind of standard. Whereas bioarchive and medRxiv have pretty strict requirements for the style of presentation and so on. On the other hand, if that's the kind of work you do, it probably sends a signal of your competence if you post it on bioarchive, because at least you were able to get it through their screening process. So that's good. One thing I want to say in response to the question about open platforms, one way we may be going, and so I mentioned that we have hypothesis annotation on soc.archive. bioarchive has an elaborate commenting system. Ultimately, we may be, hopefully, should be moving in the direction of more openness in the peer review process also. There are complicated issues having to do with confidentiality and ethics of that. On the other hand, when it's appropriate, being able to open up the peer review process, for one thing, encourages people to do peer review because their work can be recognized, and allows more people to benefit from the work of peer reviewers. So if I'm a reviewer on a paper, I might do some data analysis as part of my review. I might write an interesting essay in response as part of a review. And if I know that people are going to read that, I might put more work into it. And so we can really, we're moving in the direction perhaps of changing the process more fundamentally. But what we've done with preprints is allow people to work within the existing journal peer review process without challenging that structure. Most people don't want to go around challenging structures all the time. They want to do their research. But we are hopefully building the infrastructure that will allow us to change the system as we go.
So thank you very much. Any other question?
Yes, I was thinking, yeah, go on.
No.
And if you have camera, so please join us also via camera. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have a camera, but I have my photo on Zoom.
Don't worry.
That's enough. Yeah, so I understand and agree with all the positives of using preprints, but if I'm going to be the devil's advocate, is there any disadvantage or a reason not to use preprints?
Well, there is always a risk with exposing your work. What if it's bad, right? What if you make mistakes? You know, ideally we understand that's part of the process. And yet it does make you vulnerable. So sometimes very early scholars are rushed to publish their work that maybe 10 years from now, they're not excited to have in the public anymore. So you have to consider that. And it would be, I definitely would recommend consulting with your colleagues and mentors with the caveat, like I said, people who were trained in a different system are sometimes not open to change in the system. So it's very often a junior scholar says, my mentor says I shouldn't post a preprint, what do I do? And I understand that's a complicated relationship you have to negotiate. So so one downside is errors, and we do sometimes people come to Social Archive and they say, I posted a paper and I found a mistake and I would like to take the paper down. And in that situation, unfortunately, we say, we're sorry. We're not actually providing a service just to the author, but to the whole research community. You've posted that paper, it's part of the scholarly record. It happened, as we say, you can't unring the bell. The bell has been rung. However, you can post a new version. You can also post essentially a retraction, which may seem embarrassing also, but you can post a new version that says this paper has been withdrawn because we found errors or we're improving it. And so a new version is coming. You can post that so that people see that when they come to the page. Again, you may find that embarrassing. But overall, we definitely think the benefits outweigh the costs. So that's one. In rare cases, there are cases where journals don't support the use of preprints. I would generally avoid those journals, but I understand that not everybody has that option. Those are the only substantial downsides I can see that reasonably arise. Like I said, people are afraid of being scooped, to having their ideas taken. I don't really know of that happening. One thing that happens, that does happen a lot, is people take ideas that they have heard about informally. And I hate to say this about people's mentors and colleagues, but the people most likely to steal your work are your advisors and committee members. Not you, but other people. And that is less likely to happen, we believe, if you have made the work public. So I can think of several examples where a junior scholar or a graduate student has a great idea, they discuss it with their mentor, and then they see it in their mentor's grant application, and they feel like they've been robbed. Well, that's less likely to happen if the preprint has been published. So you ask me for downsides, and I immediately turn around and give advantages. So if I think of any other downsides, I will let you know.
That's interesting perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much for the question. I have one follow-up for that. What about disinformation? Can you see rising concerns about disinformation? Of course, it can happen if it is open access or preprint or not, but are there, for example, some plans for this social archive.org, etc., to work with the disinformation that we are living in basically now? Thank you.
That's really interesting. We do not have a plan or a strategy for responding to disinformation, and I think it would raise the question of whether we would take down work that we knew to be deliberately untrue. We haven't encountered that. I think we would have to consider that. There certainly have been preprints that have been turned out to be fraudulent. Not on Social Archive, but on the other servers. We're too small to, no one has noticed if that's happened on Social Archive. Papers have turned out to be fraudulent, or just like any other research. And if it's easier to publish it as a preprint, then it's easier to publish fraudulent work that way. So for example, there was, and then also just serious errors. In the case of COVID-19, there was a paper very early on that compared the virus to the HIV virus and said, because of the similarities, this proves that COVID-19 was engineered by humans, because there's no other way So they must have, they made a mistake in their DNA analysis, essentially. But thousands of people read that paper, and many people used it to express the view, including the conspiracy view, the false view, that COVID-19 was created by humans for malicious purposes. It was easier to publish that as a preprint than in a journal, because once real experts read it, the errors became fairly obvious. So there can be serious consequences. However, in the world today, I can just put it on my website. Like if I want to commit fraud and publish bad research, if I put it on my if I put a paper on my website and I say, this is a paper, Google Scholar will find that paper and index it on Google Scholar just because it's on my website, which has .edu. There are also private organizations, foundations, think tanks, journalists, so many people that are publishing information, including disinformation, on so many platforms that the idea of stopping it completely is not realistic. More important, I think, is a good question. I thank you for raising it, is the issue of what do we do on our platform if we find it's being used maliciously. And I sometimes joke that when we screen the papers, we're not reading and evaluating them, but we're flipping through to look for people selling products or hiding pornography or things that are obviously abuses of the system. But that does not include all the way down to reading all the text to make sure that it's not deliberately fraudulent. That's an interesting question.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from our participants? Not for now, so I have one follow-up question. What about preprints and data? Because some journals have a policy already that if you want to submit a journal, you have to submit underlining data. What about the preprints? Is the trend the same, or what's happening in this area? Thank you.
I think the trend is the same. We don't require it. And that's a question of norms of the discipline mostly. However, we do, the Social Archive sits on the Open Science Framework platform, which allows any materials to be stored and linked to the paper. So it's very easy to attach your data, your computer code, your research materials, and we certainly encourage that. And I think the trend is very much in that direction. One of the things that we want to be able to do is provide stable links. So for example, when the data is revised or the research plan is revised, the other materials are revised, they still remain linked both to the person and to the publications in terms of the metadata. So that's a very important part of the process, but it's not something that we are requiring.
And there is no concern that, for example, if I'm writing preprint, I will publish my data, so someone else will take the data, and publish it before in some journal. I don't.
Right.
I would say that I would, at least from our open science support, we sometimes got this kind of questions, from our researchers.
Yeah, that's true, and it's very. It's a good thing to mention. There are people who, especially junior scholars, who put their life into collecting their data, and it's very important to them that they have their publications to get a job, to get promoted before somebody else comes along. And it may be you're a junior scholar, you've collected a lot of data, and it takes you longer to write and publish it. But if you post that data, someone like me, old and experienced, I could write a paper in 2 days and undermine you. It doesn't happen very often, but it's possible. So it certainly is possible, and some people do, to withhold the data at the time that you post the preprint. And you can say, the data will be available at the time it's published. Now, I don't think that's ideal. As a reviewer for a journal, I would love to be able to look at the data. Even if I don't, knowing that it's possible is important. One thing, but I understand that sometimes people will do that. One thing that we actually, that the Open Science Framework platform allows, which I can mention, is you can create a blind version of your project. That is, you can create a link to the version which will serve it to a reader hiding the names, not the names in the text, but the names on the metadata. And so when I recently submitted a paper and I created this link, and I said in the paper that I submitted to the journal a blinded copy of the data and code is available at this link. So the reviewers could look at it, but they can't cite it, at least ethically, they can't use it, right? So if everybody is behaving ethically, that is one way to share the data just with a closed circle, just with the reviewers to say, for accountability, I want you to be able to evaluate this data and code, but I don't want to make it public yet. So I think there are ways to manage that that will protect the interests of researchers while still encouraging a transparent use of data as well as papers.
Okay, so thank you very much. And any other questions from our participants? So if not, I will close the loop with one last question.
Okay.
And that's about the licensing, when we started with licensing. So basically, as we discussed, in open access journals, usually the best way is CC BY. You know, that's the thing that also in my personal opinion is the best, because it brings less problems, you know, to further sharing of the work. But in the preprints, you know, if you are sharing the preprints, how often you are connecting the CC BY? It's a majority already or not? Because sometimes, at least what was sometimes mentioned, that the publisher, it's okay if you publish it in the archive, but he's not so okay if it is publishing with the CC BY license. So basically, it's sometimes like free to read, but not free to reuse. You know, so can you comment on that? Thank you.
It's interesting, you know, most researchers really don't know what to do. And I sympathize. We have different legal situations in different parts of the world. We have different obligations, including to our future selves and publishers. So there really is not one answer to that. We used to only have CC BY and CC0 on Social Archive, or no license. We always had the no license option, the most restrictive option. But researchers really asked us, they especially want the NC, the non-commercial option. And that feels intuitively, a lot of people just feel like they don't want their work to be used commercially. That's not why they're doing it. They're not trying to make money. They don't want somebody else to make money. They don't want to undermine future publishing. So the NC licenses are pretty popular. I don't think it makes that much difference. One thing that I see, there was just a paper published in Nature, article published in Nature yesterday about unscrupulous journals publishing people's papers without their permission. But it wasn't preprints, it was journal articles. They were just taking the text of journal articles and publishing them again and calling and saying, look, we have a great journal. And it's difficult to stop that, because the individual author, has to find it, has to find out that it happened, has to bring some kind of legal claim. And if they're doing it on a large scale, it is very difficult. So one thing that could happen with preprint servers, you put it up with an open license, somebody could publish it in a journal and they could say it's peer reviewed. So it could actually be threatening to us. I have never seen this happen, but I do realize that there are risks to putting work out with open licenses. If for example, if I publish work in American sociology journals, they all say they will not publish work that has already been peer reviewed, already been published peer reviewed. So if somebody takes my preprint and publishes it in their journal, they could even peer review it without even telling me, right? So they could say, we have a peer reviewed article here by Philip Cohen, and put it in their journal. I can't stop that from happening. I would then have to convince my journal that I want to publish it in, I had nothing to do with that. But they might still choose not to publish it. Again, I don't know of that happening, but I do think we have to realize that, especially with the technology making it so easy to capture and republish work, that things like this are going to happen. And we have to think about the infrastructure to protect ourselves as a community. It's not so much a personal risk at this point. If that really happened, we could work it out to protect, one person's career. But I do think we need to think about it structurally. And I think it's a case where the library people and the information professionals and the researchers and the funders need to work together to develop the infrastructure, because we should not be just waiting until some catastrophe like that strikes. It's a great question. That's an important question.
Thank you very much. So, but important message after all this presentation is definitely go for preprints. Really think about it. Maybe it can accelerate your career. And definitely, for example, in the Horizon Europe, the new grant scheme in Europe, this is one of the recommended practice together with pre-registration, etc., etc.
And there's strength in numbers. Let me just say, if we all do it together, then you're not taking an individual risk. It's a community standard at that point, and that's very important. Sorry to interrupt.
No, don't worry, don't worry. And yeah. So basically, this is it. So we are in the end of our session, and also we are closing all the Open Access Week at Masaryk University in 2021. I'm very happy that Professor, you were here with us today, and thank you very much for all the participants and for me for your presentation. And it would be, at least from my point of view as an open science support, so it would be very nice to see what the preprint schema and also what's going to happen in data preprints, I would say, in coming years globally. So it will be something, I think, quite new. And for example, as you mentioned, social archive is work is basically based on open science framework. So basically, this is one of the infrastructure that can enable you to do also pre-registration and then sharing a lot of stuff also together with data. So yeah, so that's it. Basically, thank you very much once again, and it was a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks to the audience for coming too. Thank you very much.
Yeah.